Hello and welcome to Connected. I'm Divya Gopalan. So, what would war look like if China invaded Taiwan? And would Taiwan be able to fend off its giant and more militarily powerful neighbor? Well, these are just some of the questions that have become part of daily discourse after Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Now, Taiwan has wrapped up its biggest annual military exercise, the Han drills, and for the first time, the exercises simulated an attack on the country's main international airport and prepared for a scenario where an enemy force puts boots on the ground. The questions we're asking, though, is what is the future of warfare, and can technology even the battlefield between Taiwan and China? For this discussion, we are joined by defense expert and entrepreneur Angshu Chakravarti from London, United Kingdom, and Dr. Junyi Lee from Taiwan's Institute of National Defense and Security Research in Taipei. Gentlemen, thank you very much for joining the program. I'm going to start with you, Angshu, and it's a pretty big question, but combat has changed and evolved drastically since the World Wars. Where do you see would be the biggest change as we go forward in the future of warfare?
To be honest, if you look at the evolution of warfare techniques and the tools being used, in my opinion, I think one of the drastic and the biggest changes that has happened is in the forms of the tools that are being used for kinetic operations, which include significant usage of EWS or electronic warfare and suppression systems, as well as, of course, as we've all seen during the Nagorno-Karabakh crisis and conflict recently, and thereafter now in the Ukrainian conflict, the significant usage of drones, EWS, and the swarm of drones, as well as the kamikaze drones. So it's one of the major challenges which is now going to shape the battlefield on the ground, whether it be open terrain or urban warfare. So that's where we see a huge and a big change.
Okay, Junyi, then, in that case, given the direction Angshu is saying that warfare is going, do you think Taiwan is heading that way and Taiwan's military will be prepared for such a scenario?
Well, I think the answer is that Taiwan is moving toward that direction, although the pace with which may not be satisfactory for many outside world observers. So let me explain this. I think before we talk about how prepared Taiwan is, I think it is necessary to say something about our assessment. I mean, Taiwan's Ministry of National Defense perspective of Taiwan's security environment first. I think very briefly speaking, China's invasion of Taiwan hinges on three factors. Number one, intention. The Chinese leadership certainly has that intention to take Taiwan by force, although we can discuss whether and in what circumstances taking back Taiwan by force becomes a top priority for the Chinese leadership. And second, when it comes to capability, no doubt the PLA has been modernizing, and the disparity of military strength between Taiwan and China keeps increasing in favor of China. The fact that China hasn't launched or hasn't showed a clear sign of invading Taiwan, I think, is because there are several obstacles in execution. So execution is the third element. And to break down, I think there are four elements, to say the least. First, there is a U.S. factor. Any PLA planner must assume that the U.S. will intervene in a cross-strait contingency. So if the PLA cannot occupy Taiwan in days or weeks, it will have to confront the U.S. directly. And this remains very risky for the PLA and the Chinese leadership. Second, to occupy Taiwan, the PLA needs sufficient amphibious capability, which requires a massive construction of landing vessels and platforms. The PLA is most vulnerable when the troops are transported across the strait. And third, even if the PLA manages to land on Taiwan, engaging in an urban warfare is not an easy task. And recently, there are several articles circulated in China's social media and against the idea of unifying Taiwan by force. And one of the reasons given was that the urban warfare remains one of the most difficult warfare in human history. And it is not likely that the PLA can do well fighting in Taiwan's mega and very complex cities. And fourth, given that China is in territorial disputes with many of its neighbors, the Chinese leadership also needs to take into consideration their possible reactions when the invasion of Taiwan becomes lengthy and costly. So from here, I think Taiwan's objective is to ensure these obstacles remain and even become more difficult for the PLA. And here is the function, the purpose of the Hanguang exercises. I think in particularly the parts on live fire drills and the anti-air dropping exercises in the Taoyuan International Airport are attempts to address the second obstacle I just outlined. I think it is fair to say that Taiwan is moving in the right direction, and in that many of the exercises and trainings are also verified in Ukraine's fighting against Russia. Of course,
right. I do want to talk a little bit more about that a little bit later in the program, but I'm so glad you brought up the Hanguang exercises and gave us some context to that. But before we go further, for the benefit of our audience, we're going to play out this piece on the Hanguang military exercises from our TaiwanPlus reporter, Jaime Ocon. Now, he reports on the drills focusing on one of the key concerns, that's keeping Air Force assets safe from an attack from China. Take a look.
Taiwanese fighter jets are getting ready to leave their home base. For the past 2 weeks, pilots across the country have been training for Taiwan's largest annual military drills, the Hanguang exercises, by flying back and forth across the main island. It's part of the military's plan to protect as many assets like fighter jets as possible in the event of an attack, and it starts with these pilots.
Planning is extremely important. You can't just expect people to be able to perform without proper training or planning. And I think that's what we should be focusing on, what Taiwan's armed forces should be focusing on in this upcoming exercise.
Taiwan's military was scheduled to use Taidong's Fengnian Airport, a civilian airfield, to practice how to land cargo planes and F-16s on Tuesday. But those drills were canceled due to weather concerns from nearby typhoon Doksuri. The exercises would have practiced a scenario where, in order to protect aircraft, Taiwan would pull back its planes from western bases close to China and redeploy them to the east coast. In the event of a war, this would help Taiwan preserve its fighter planes, but analysts argue that it's only part of the solution.
You know, if a damaged plane lands there, well, do you have the repair parts? Do you have fuel, ammunition, that kind of thing already pre-positioned? Short of that, it's great to have a better, a wider set of places to land in and to deploy from, but it's not going to complicate China's strategy unless you can have all those pre-positioned stockpiles.
China has ramped up its military presence and operations around Taiwan, and there are concerns that Beijing could be ready to launch an attack as early as 2027. While there's no sign of an imminent attack, Taiwan has doubled down on more mobile systems and hardware that has a greater chance of surviving, things like vehicle-mounted missiles and anti-tank weapons. This combination of protecting airfields and beefing up its arsenal is not just a display for the Hanguang exercises, but some analysts say it's also a demonstration for other countries to see just how prepared Taiwan is.
So the most important message to give China is that Taiwan can hold out. The military of Taiwan can defend the island for at least a month, enough time for the United States military to come to Taiwan's aid. So scale does matter to a degree, but some of the focus on defensive assets, dispersal, so it looks like the military can survive, keep on fighting, and create obstacles for the Chinese military.
Military strategists and officials here at Taiwan's Defense Ministry have been constantly changing and adapting the country's security strategy in light of an evolving situation with China. Now, this week's Hanguang military exercises are a chance for the country to test its response plan to see if they're effective in ensuring the country's security. Andy Shui and Jaime Ocon in Taipei for TaiwanPlus.
Okay, Angshu, let me go to you. From a global perspective, how do you view these military exercises? And do you think they go far enough in preparing for a future war, say a war years down the line?
Now, taking it a bit further into the future warfare, typically any island to build its defense systems would use a porcupine strategy. So you would create multiple deterrents. And when you want to create deterrents, so you will look at not only the kinetic operations which you are building in wargaming scenarios, putting your specific fighter squadrons in a specific format to counter certain landings or aerial dominance, aerial superiority, etc. But you would also focus on a kind of deterrence which is using today's modern means. We look at Nord Stream. Nord Stream is a classic example, which was, trying to cause enough damage to the enemy economically and in a geostrategic manner without running full-fledged kinetic operations. So that is one area which really helps nations in today's, especially smaller, nations to fight off. And the second would be for a smaller power, a smaller entity to run effective ideological warfare, psyops, etc., using the different kinds of media available to run these operations so as to deter and disarm the whole objective and the human elements of your opponent forces, not to invade, to have a feeling of not doing the right thing by going into X country from Y country. So that's one of the things that's very critical to also look at. So there are multiple deterrents which, from a hybrid perspective, one needs to operate on.
Indeed, and I do want to go into them in a bit more detail a little later on, and we do have some sound bites on the psyops that you did mention. But I do want to bring it down to the idea of external elements and bringing it down to these Han Kwang exercises. And I suppose this is one of the external elements that should not deter warfare or an attack or defense. But in the military exercises, it happened. As mentioned in that report, and Junyi, the military exercises stopped for the typhoon. Why is that? And that seems a bit counterintuitive, because that would be exactly the scenario they should be trying to practice in.
Yes, I think some of the exercises were cancelled due to the typhoon Doksuri, and this indeed triggered some debates in Taiwan as well. The criticism holds that a war can take place even if the weather condition is not in the POS favor. And so we need to make the exercises real or more real. On the contrary, those support the ministry's decision argue that it is almost impossible for the PLA to move across the strait, launch rockets and missiles, and bombard Taiwan in extreme weather conditions like a typhoon. But my take, I think even if the PLA is not likely to launch a war when a typhoon is coming, it is nevertheless very likely that with a war prolonging, our armed forces need to operate in extreme weather conditions. So I personally would say that it is important for the armed forces, local government, other agencies involved, and even the public to be trained and prepared in such scenarios. The difficulty, of course, is because we're in a democratic system, individuals' well-being and safety is of the most important issue for the government. So I think there is still some time and some space needed for the country, for the government to communicate with the public, and also to have some internal review within the government as to whether we should cancel part or all of the exercises on
so in other words,
weather. Yes.
Trying to minimize risk. Now I want to take you to another aspect of these exercises, and that was for the first time we saw them played out in an international airport. Why do you think that was necessary, and why is it only being done now?
as a matter of fact, this is not the first exercise. I mean, in our civil defense system, our homeland security system, there have been exercises regarding the international airport is seized by some malign groups, not necessarily a foreign country. So the government or Taiwan has been prepared for such a scenario. But I think this, of course, this is the first time that the Hong Kong exercises put such a scenario within part of its training program. And I think here, the war in Ukraine plays a significant part because we have witnessed how the Russian attempt to seize Kiev failed. And so I think this is a very good example of how warfare in other places can shed light on our preparedness in Taiwan here.
Let's move on to another kind of hostile onslaught that is happening on a daily basis, no matter where you are. Cybersecurity expert Chen Yi-Tu explains why cyber war scenarios featured in the Hong Kong exercises.
I think for the cyber part is it's a very critical one. It's a very tricky one. Is that it's a critical evolving realms and domains that no one actually really thinks they are fully prepared for the followings, and everyone seems to find the best way of, even in the organization, in their strategies. So I would say, given that it's still ongoing challenges that everyone mutual facing, but I think that key will be a whole government resilience, that not just about I speak from the military sides, but also there are civilian government and private sectors close collaboration. And I think Taiwan is still gradually heading out in that direction.
Angshu, I want to ask you this question. Even before the first shot is fired or the first boots go on the ground, is there any way cyber warfare can cripple a nation?
Most definitely, so not just from a crippling of the nation, much more than that. So in terms of the network resilience, and in terms of the current scenario where AI has already achieved, especially in the military domain, the achievements that AI used in cyber warfare can cause is very, very, very large scale. So to give you a very real example, if you saw a lot of the grids during the Kiev exercise, during the Kiev incursion by the Russian forces at the very beginning, there was an element of cyber warfare which is already engaged by the Russians, and it had disabled multiple the infrastructure capabilities of Ukraine before they entered. However, it failed. The onslaught failed because the lack of clear objectives and planning by the Russian military, which went in complete disarray. However, what's noteworthy is that their cyber warfare capabilities had already caused massive damage and significant reduction of warfighting capabilities and human mobilization capabilities. Because during warfighting, at the end of the day, even whether you use drone swarms, EWS missiles, you will need the human element to trigger and to occupy and take over the different resources where you are heading to. So that is one very critical element of future warfighting, where you use large-scale hybrid asymmetric cyber warfare with a very clear element of AI inbuilt into it, which proliferates into all your networks and debilitates the opponent. So that is going to play a very critical role.
Okay. So in that case, Junyi, is Taiwan doing enough to fend off or protect itself from cyber attacks and a possible bigger cyber warfare?
I think yes. The answer is yes. Taiwan has been facing cyber attacks tens of thousands times a day. So we have accumulated rich experiences in fighting against, in fending off those cyber attacks and to increase our resilience. But of course, the task in the future will be how cyber attack or cyber warfare becomes part of an overall becomes part of China's full-scale invasion. And how would this play out? It will be a task for our defense planning officers to think about.
Right.
And,
okay.
Sorry.
I want to jump in here as we're running out of time, I'm afraid. And I just want to show our viewers some numbers. So take a look at this graphic. This shows how Taiwan's military manpower is stacked up against China's People Liberation Army. Now, Taiwan has 196,000 army personnel against more than 2 million soldiers. Okay, so let me get Junyi to directly respond to those numbers. What do you think Taiwan's best chances are for standing up for itself when it comes to the scenario of invasion? Would it be relying on its technology, or would it be more the physical aspect of the island, as you had brought in or talked about earlier?
I think we all have high hopes on technology, but the problem is they haven't been really tested in the battlefield, and so on that regard, Taiwan certainly has a lot to do. But so apart from that, I would say that the willingness to resist, and also the resilience of the society, as Anshu just mentioned, are the key for us, and these are the most fundamental and basic elements for our national defense.
I think to make oneself impervious to such large-scale difference in numbers, the primary area of focus should be to specifically look at the opponent's capabilities in terms of remote warfare, because any nation today in the future of warfare, before they unleash kinetic operations, will definitely look at two. One is applying their missiles and rocket forces and space forces as much as possible. How do you disable them? How do you shield yourself? And how do you create deterrence and anti-battery resilient systems in your domain? And the second, which is very critical, is how do you ensure that once the initial onslaught of the rocket forces and your capabilities of cyber warfare are taken care of, how do you ensure that you do not give complete air superiority to an enemy? Because air superiority is going to play a very critical role. And again, denial of air superiority is not necessarily a function of the number of resources that one has. There are multiple other techniques and tools that can be used to deny air superiority. And there are some lessons that can be drawn from the Ukrainian conflict. So that is the second very most important part, because when you deny air superiority, you make it all that more difficult for your opponent to have boots on the ground, to really occupy your terrain, despite, and then you look at the urban warfare and the guerrilla tactics coming in much later, but that is when you're full-fledged into your kinetic operations. But before that, if you deny air superiority, that definitely goes a very, very long way for you to be resilient. And in a war of attrition, you do not get into a war of attrition, because once you get into a war of attrition, then it is numbers. I mean, although the invading force has a 3-to-1, requirement. So it's already much more difficult. However, without getting the war of attrition, I think these are two elements that one should focus on if one is in a situation like Taiwan, a small island.
Thank you very much, gentlemen. I'm afraid we'll have to leave it there. It's been great to get your thoughts on this, and it's a conversation that needs to be continued. Angshu Chakravarti speaking to us from London in the United Kingdom, thank you so much. And Dr. Junyi from Taiwan's Institute of National Defense and Security Research in Taipei. It's been a pleasure to have you on the show. Thank you. Well, this has been a very interesting and critical conversation on the future of war. We hope it's a scenario we will never have to face. And of course, we spare thought to all the countries in the world that are currently in conflict. To our viewers, it has been good to have your company. Thank you and stay connected.